I think one of the coldest days of the year, if not the nastiest. I'm Geoffrey Kemp, the Senior Director for Regional Strategic Affairs here at the Centre. And I think one of the reasons you've turned out for this event is A, it's so beautifully topical, we couldn't have planned it better. And secondly, we have two outstanding speakers. And primarily, I hope they're going to focus on the ongoing standoff in Kashmir between India and Pakistan and the implications, particularly for the region, of the American decisions on Afghanistan and how that affects relations with the countries that have equally strong interests in Afghanistan, like Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and Iran. When I said we had two exceptional speakers, I mean it. We're going to start with Husain Haqqani on my right, who's currently at the Hudson Institute, where he directs the program for South and Central Asia. I think many of us know him best for the time he was here as Pakistan's ambassador during the period 2008 and 11, during a very critical phase in the global war on terrorism. He's worked for four Pakistani Prime Ministers, including Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif. And in his younger years, he was ambassador to what was then a beautiful island that the United States Navy had huge interest in, which I got deeply involved in, namely Sri Lanka. But that was a long time ago, Hussein. Gerald Feierstein, who we've had here before in his capacity as recent ambassador to Yemen, where we had a very interesting discussion of the crisis there. He's here today in part because he spent at least half his career in Pakistan and therefore knows South Asia very, very well. He's currently the Senior Vice President at the Middle East Institute, but has served duty not only in Pakistan, but Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and was, as I say, ambassador to Yemen. So, without any further ado, my instructions to the two speakers are, since they're highly professional, 15 minutes max opening up the story. We'll then go to Q&A. I only have two rules for the Q&A. One, you wait for a microphone to come before you so that we can all hear you, and secondly, you tell us who you are, since not everybody knows everybody else. Other than that, welcome, gentlemen, and Hussein, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that very kind introduction and for the wonderful sushi. The Center for the National Interest is the only think tank in Washington, D.C. that serves sushi at lunch. And that just proves one point, that sushi is definitely in the national interest. Now, there used to be a time when denial was just a river in Egypt. Now it's a state of mind in South Asia. I recently wrote a piece in the Washington Post about India-Pakistan crisis and their four stages over at least the last 20 years. The four stages are: stage one, Pakistan, eager to try and get international attention for what it considers to be a forgotten dispute over Kashmir, encourages or tolerates a terrorist attack in India or in Indian-occupied Kashmir. India gets angry and retaliates, either by mobilizing troops along the Pakistan-India border or, as has been more recently the case, threatening surgical strikes on terrorist training camps in Pakistan. Pakistan immediately raises the prospect of nuclear war. In fact, it's very interesting. A study of the Indian media during this whole crisis shows that they barely mentioned the nuclear weapons or India's nuclear weapons capability. Pakistanis did nothing else but mention just two words, Kashmir and nuclear weapons, and how the world owes it to the region and get involved, please get involved. So it follows that pattern. And then the fourth is de-escalation until, of course, the next terrorist strike. And that pattern has been repeated since 1999, when the Kargil war came about. It has been repeated again this time. Some things are changing. For example, there is was an unwillingness on the part of the United States to do the high-profile diplomacy that they did at the time of the Kargil war. There is a willingness to try and kind of call Pakistan's bluff, that you have to figure out how to de-escalate it sometimes. You start it, but then you make it into with terrorism, and then you make it into a India-Pakistan thing and a potential nuclear flashpoint business, and everybody has to do what you want. So we do not know how this will play out moving forward. I think that the real way to coerce Pakistan into changing behavior, and those of us, and I don't know what Jerry will say, but most of us in this town who deal with or study or speak about Pakistan, and in my case have served the Pakistani government and state at one point in their life, have reached the conclusion that Pakistan is unlikely to change its basic foreign policy paradigm anytime soon. So it was very interesting. Just before I came here, I read the speech and tried to do one of those sort of computer little things of, okay, if I merge Imran Khan's speech about terrorism and the actions he's going to take with Musharraf's speech of January 2002, when he announced that he's going to move against terrorists, how many sentences are going to be more or less exactly identical, so that there is no, how when you merge documents, they tell you what sentences are exact. And it was a very interesting exercise. It's more or less the same arguments. This time you can trust me. In Imran Khan's case, I'm the honest cricketer who's not financially corrupt, and I and the military are on the same page. This is his new line. But Musharraf was a combination of the civilian leader and the military leader. He was commander of the army and he was president of the country, both at the same time. So you couldn't have had more unity of command than you had under Musharraf. And why didn't anything change then? And my argument for that is that Pakistan, it's the nature of the Pakistani state. Pakistan inherited a larger military at the time of partition than its size warranted. It got only 17% of British India's resources, but 33% of British India's army, because of the British recruiting policies of how and where they used to recruit people from. So Pakistan started out with a larger army than it needed. It's not like most countries that raise an army to match the size of the threat they face. Pakistan actually had an army and has since been raising threats to match the size of the army it inherited. And that the only reasonable threat that Pakistanis can emotionally associate with is India. But Pakistan is also increasing the threat from Afghanistan. In the last few years, Pakistanis have been developing an argument that Afghanistan is going to be a threat to Pakistan down the road, etc. So Pakistan must exercise a forward policy of controlling Afghanistan. Unfortunately, because of the instruments that have been chosen by the Pakistani state over the last 3 decades, going back to the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, Islamists are the only reliable tool and ally for the Pakistani military. And so that makes it difficult for them to accomplish their goals without relying on these Islamist extremists. On the other hand, Pakistan's own track record is becoming worse and worse. I mean, it's a country that's only 72 years old. The name Pakistan is only 78 years old. I mean, there are many countries that come about by inventing some history and saying there used to be this kingdom in 600 years ago and we are reviving that. Pakistan is a total fabrication in the sense of the name having been totally contrived. It's an acronym, etc. So Pakistan's people, of course, need a basis for why they are in one country. And the basis can be a practical basis, which is something I've been advocating, and many others do, that it can be a union of the various peoples that live there, and it can be a democratic union, it can be a federation. But instead, because of the militarist nature of the state, it has to be a centralized state. And so the narrative is essentially just about being India's equal. And that creates some very absurd situations sometimes. For example, when the last time Pakistan beat India at a cricket match in a trophy, Champions Trophy in England, it was the Pakistan Army chief that announced a reward for the Pakistani cricket team because they had vanquished the enemy. That doesn't happen elsewhere. So you have this narrative that's not going to easily change, but it's very deeply felt by at least a significant portion of the Pakistani populace. On the other hand, Pakistan's track record of the last 72 years, 4 full-fledged wars, 1 alleged genocide, loss of half the country's land area in conflict, secession of the majority population. The Bengalis were the majority at that time in 1971 when they seceded. Several proxy or civil wars, 4 direct military coups, multiple constitutions, long periods without constitutional rule, frequent religious and sectarian strife, repeated economic failures, numerous political assassinations, unremitting terrorism, continued external dependence, and chronic social underdevelopment. Just to give you an example, last year Pakistan had 2 interesting social markers. One was Pakistan fell to being the country in the world with the highest infant mortality rate. To think that hadn't happened in the preceding 70 years. So something's gone really wrong, that now Pakistan's infant mortality rate is higher than that of Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia. Second is that Pakistan's literacy rate shrunk by 1% instead of increasing. And that is particularly disturbing. So in terms of economic prospects, that makes Pakistan's big picture economic prospects difficult. But the state does okay, because even now, because of the strategic location, because of the fact that it has a very large military, Pakistan was able to negotiate borrowing from China, Saudi Arabia, and UAE recently to stave off an economic crisis, and apparently they will be going to the IMF again. The Pakistani view, or the state view, is that the United States wants to get out of Afghanistan. It will need an exit strategy. We will be the key to the exit strategy, just as we were the key to the getting them involved strategy. So we got paid for getting involved. Now we will probably be able to benefit from helping and facilitating the exit. In the short term, that might work. I mean, there will be people who will say, you know what, we need Pakistan's help in doing this, and there might be some kind of a settlement with the Taliban that Pakistan facilitates, and for that there might be some short-term rewards. But there is just no getting out of the deeper crisis that Pakistan is creating for itself as a state because of the factors that I mentioned. If you don't have a literate population, you don't have human capital development. If you don't have that, where will you make the money to be able to pay back all the loans that you can? You can try and leverage your strategic location as much as you like, but there will come a time, there have been other countries in history that have had this notion of strategic location, but strategic concerns change. And so, for example, if the American focus moves totally to the Pacific region, then Pakistan becomes sort of less relevant. The Russians, the Chinese, they have an interest in that geographic area, but they will deal with Pakistan very differently from the way the Americans did. Even in terms of giving money to Pakistan, the Chinese have these huge infrastructure projects that they are promising to the Pakistanis, but they are not, unlike the Americans, willing to give outright grants, etc. So that'll put stresses. And very frankly, I think that those are factors that we must remember. So in a nutshell, the India-Pakistan shall we say, problem persisting, with Pakistan continuing to think that pinpricks will force India's hand. Now, when I said denial is a state of mind in South Asia, there's an Indian part of the denial as well. And that denial is in relation to the territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir, of course, dispute going back to 1947 may not be resolved the way it was originally conceptualized in terms of being resolved. But India will have to find a way to deal with the people of Kashmir who are embattled and unhappy. And the more India doubles down in terms of putting in military and paramilitary into the villages, ostensibly to deal with terrorism, the more the Kashmiri population becomes restive. It's India's only Muslim majority state, and it originally, the Indian government's policy in the 50s and 60s was to recognize that and kind of pay attention to that and give them additional benefits to keep them in the Indian Union. Now those incentives have been taken away, and Prime Minister Modi's Hindutva identity, the Hindu nationalism, does not play well with the Muslim population of India, and certainly not with the Kashmiri people. So even if the terrorism was not a factor, Kashmir would still be a problem that needs to be dealt with. The mounting human rights violations, etc., you can't just keep denying them. So on the Pakistani side, we will continue to have this sort of different levels of use of terrorism as a way of trying to create a strategic advantage in relation to India. Pakistan thinks that since it has nuclear weapons, therefore a conventional war is unlikely. And so under the shadow of nuclear weapons, you can keep sub-conventional warfare going forever and ever, to the point where the Indians say, gosh, we are tired, what do you want? And I think that's what the hope is for. They think that that has already worked in case of Afghanistan, that we just kept it going. The Americans never said, I mean, the business of safe havens, terrorist safe havens or Taliban safe havens in Pakistan has been discussed since at least 2004, 2005. And yet the Americans were never willing to take the risk of alienating Pakistan by striking any of those camps directly or putting greater pressure on Pakistan. So the frustration in Washington, of course, as one of my interlocutors recently said to me, was we gave aid and that was incentive to change. That didn't work. We are trying to punish and that isn't working. What will? And I said, maybe reconciling to the fact that nothing will work may enable you to develop policy tools that might eventually end up working. So that is where I think the South Asian region's situation is. I'll also say a few words about the Afghan peace process. Maybe we can do that during the question and answer.
So, thank you so much. Excellent overview. Thank you. Jerry.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the Center for inviting me to come back. I'm afraid that I only come to discuss bad news. Someday you'll invite me to talk about Denmark or something a little bit more pleasant. But fundamentally, as we anticipated before we started, I agree with almost everything that Husain said, and to a certain extent, you can say that nothing ever changes in the context of Pakistan. Pusa change is an old Urdu saying, and I think that still in the Pakistani mindset that would still be the case, although I'm not entirely convinced that in the American mindset it still works the same way that as Husain laid out, that the Pakistanis think that it does. Just to begin with, the strategic environment that the Pakistanis find themselves in, fundamentally the same situation that we've been in since 1978, 1979. The fundamental, critical role that Pakistan played in terms of the intervention in Afghanistan, enabling the defeat of the former Soviet Union, the issues that we worked on very closely back in 1981, 1982 of building up Pakistan's capacity, and certainly as Husain laid out, the Pakistanis were not wrong in coming to certain conclusions about the centrality of Pakistan in the strategic calculus of the United States in the region. It was true in the 1980s, but it has become subsequently less true. I mean, it became true again in 2001 after the terror attacks here, but we've been on a declining path for the last 10 or 15 years. But in terms of Afghanistan, what I would say is, and we'll look forward to what Husain has to say about the Afghan peace process, but the reality is that the centrality of Pakistan to the United States in the post-2001 period was really not only in terms of the effort to defeat the terrorist threat and to contain the terrorist threat inside Pakistan and in Afghanistan, but of course the absolute strategic requirement that the United States have through Pakistan access to Afghanistan. We couldn't use Iran as an alternative. We tried to use the Central Asian republics without terribly much success. It proved not to be the answer that people had hoped it would be. So really, in terms of the air lines of communication, the ground lines of communication for the United States to supply our forces in Afghanistan and to supply the Afghan forces, we had to have Pakistan. And as a result, that was really driving an awful lot of the strategic thinking in the Bush administration and then subsequently in the Obama administration about why we had to, despite our continuing frustration with Pakistani policy, why we needed to continue to work with them and continue to try to, as best we could, bring them along and bring them in our camp. With the decline of the U.S. military presence and engagement, clearly you have an administration now that is determined to leave Afghanistan as soon as we figure out the formula of peace with honor in Afghanistan will be gone. And therefore, that strategic requirement to maintain the close relationship with Pakistan simply doesn't exist anymore. Husain may be completely right that we will want the Pakistanis to help maneuver the Taliban to give us enough time to get out so that it's not embarrassing for the United States. But it really doesn't go beyond that. As far as I can tell, psychologically, intellectually, this administration has already gone from Afghanistan, and therefore Pakistan isn't quite that significant. The other reality that's changed, certainly since 1981, 1982, is a substantial change in terms of the U.S. focus in the region, shifting to a much more Indo-centric vision than it was early on. Indira Gandhi is gone, and therefore, the administrations that followed along, whether it's Bush, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, have really tried to emphasize building up that relationship with India, to a certain extent at Pakistan's expense. And it was interesting that as his measure, Husain was talking about the difference between the U.S. reaction to Kargil versus the reaction to Pulwana. For me, and maybe because I was there, the really significant measure is the difference of the U.S. reaction to Pulwana versus our reaction to Mumbai in 2008, and the extraordinary lengths that the U.S. went to in 2008 to try to manage this confrontation between India and Pakistan over the terror attack, even though we were certainly convinced that the Pakistanis were as guilty as India alleged, but nevertheless try to manage and manipulate and ameliorate the blowback against Pakistan, versus the Pulwana reaction, which I agree with Husain completely. The United States basically said, we are not interested. We're not going to get involved in this. You guys figure it out. And lo and behold, the interesting thing is that they did figure it out. And maybe this is the best news that we've had. And it goes back again to one of Hussein's concluding thoughts, which is maybe no strategy is the best strategy of all. Because when left to their own devices, we saw Imran Khan back down. We saw the Pakistani military back down, because if the Pakistani military wasn't backing down, Imran wouldn't have been either. And you know, basically they managed to diffuse this crisis themselves. Whether that means that there's now an opening for India and Pakistan to have a better and more interesting dialogue about Kashmir and about these other issues remains to be seen. But I don't think it's a negative sign that the United States basically walked away from that problem. So fundamentally, and I'll look at it. Excuse me. I'll look at it from you know, kind of an American perspective. What I would say is that, you know, once again, the United States and Pakistan are on the downward slope of the roller coaster that we've been on since 1947, and that our relationship has been based on mutual misunderstanding from the very beginning. We and the Pakistanis have never actually understood what the other side wanted or expected of this relationship, and so we've stumbled along, you know, for 72 years. You know, continuously surprising each other, disappointing each other, frustrating each other, and we're no farther along in that context today than we were, you know, in the 1950s, in the 1960s. All of those issues continue to be a problem. You know, again, going back to the post-2001 situation, where we had the Kerry-Lugar legislation, we thought that we were going to put these issues behind us. I remember very well being in those conversations. John Kerry came out to see us when he was still in the Senate. Joe Biden came out to see us when he was still in the Senate before he became the vice president, to talk about how we were going to turn the page with Pakistan. We were going to erase the history, and we were going to build this new relationship, you know, based on a realistic understanding of one another. Well, that lasted for about 3 days. And then we were right back to where we were before. Hussein will remember all of the fights that we had about Kerry-Lugar, and the Pakistani military suspicions that this was an effort on the United States' part to destroy the Pakistani military. You know, the differences that we had, not only over terrorism in Afghanistan, but also the terrorism in Pakistan, and our inability to communicate and to arrive at any kind of reasonable resolution of, you know, how we are going to address this mutual problem that we had. And the reality is that Imran Khan is going to continue the same kind of situation, because he is absolutely the creature of the Pakistani military. As long as the Pakistani military is calling the shots, we are going to have the same problems. The other reality is, you know, we talked a little bit. I mean, Russia, China, Iran, all players. Iran was a player in 2001 in Afghanistan. The interesting thing about the Iranians is that they played both sides against the middle. They were absolutely essential partners for us in Berlin in 2001. We would never have arrived at the resolution in the Loya Jirga that you know, basically resolved the political crisis inside Afghanistan had it not been for Iranian help. But at the same time, IRGC was supporting guys who were going after us. They were supporting the Taliban. They were doing these other things to undercut our presence and undercut our initiative. So Iran playing both sides of the game is nothing new. They've been doing that for 18 years. The Russians, of course, I think a little bit opportunism on the part of the Putin, but also perhaps a little bit of getting some of their own back. But the interesting thing and the important thing, I think, in terms of Pakistan is the absolute change in the balance of interest between the United States and China. And as we go forward, as we look at issues like the Pakistani role in Afghanistan, or like the Pakistani role in the region more broadly, the reality is that we have fewer cards to play in our hand than we've ever had before in the entire history of our relationship with Pakistan, and that now it's really the Chinese who are calling the shots. The only good thing that you can say about that is because of their own concerns about their Muslim populations in Western China, that to a certain extent the Chinese share the same concerns that we have about Pakistan's inability or unwillingness to address seriously the issue of violent extremism inside of their own borders, and how that percolates out to its neighbors, both east, west, and possibly also north. So I think I have used my allotted time, and I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jerry. These were two very elucidating presentations. While you're all deciding who's going to put their hand up, and I'll take a list of the names, I'll ask a question to both speakers. Since you agree on so much, maybe we could talk a little bit more about India, because it sort of seemed to be, from what you were saying, there's a crisis is over, that they both sort of managed this well. As I understand it, though, there's an enormous amount of unfinished business in India, at least. We've got an election coming up. Hindu nationalism is not going away. First, do you think this could flare up again in the context of Indian politics? And the second question is more to do with, both of you sort of referred to the deep state, namely the Pakistani army. I mean, for a number of years there was discussion around this town about a new breed of soldier in Pakistan who looked out at the world and saw the great benefits of having a better relationship with India, particularly in the economic arena. But both of you seem to suggest that no, these ghosts, the ghosts of Kashmir, the ghosts of Bangladesh, the ghosts of partition itself, are still the driving force behind the Indian army, even today. Is there any Pakistani army, even today? Is there any hope for any change in that direction?
May I take the two questions quickly? First of all, if I created the impression that the crisis is over, then that was an erroneous impression. I didn't mean to. All I said was that the 4 stages of crisis have moved a little faster because the external involvement has been relatively less. There could be another terrorist strike or a terrorist attack, and we could have the cycle again. India could actually find something that is a convenient target on the Pakistani side that they think they can actually deal with a surgical strike, and Modi, to try and look more robust and more assertive, might take that opportunity, because after all they've already crossed the Rubicon. They've already done it twice now, that we can actually, the fear of nuclear weapons is not going to stop us from acting against terrorists. And this time they had nobody in the world, including China, speak about that. I mean, China didn't issue the statement saying this was a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty and should not have taken place. All they said was, we request both sides to de-escalate and to solve things by talking to each other. No condemnation. So that might embolden Mr. Modi. And of course, the Hindutva politics is very Hindu nationalist politics. Is basically pregnant with the potential for quote unquote teach Pakistan a lesson, quote Muslims of India teach Muslims of India a lesson. And so therefore between now and election time, although the time is short and Mr. Modi does have a lot of problems, he doesn't have the economic achievements he wanted to run on, so he might actually use this as his main election card. So that threat is very much there. On the subject of the changes in the Pakistan Army, look, Jerry was, he reminded me of all the effort that I had put in negotiating the Kerry-Lugar bill, and then the Pakistan Army's reaction to it. And I had asked the generals who were opposed to the Kerry-Lugar bill, and what was the Kerry-Lugar bill? It was a commitment by well-meaning liberal American members of Congress that, Pakistanis should not feel that we just pay them for services rendered for the military. We'll actually invest in Pakistan's infrastructure and healthcare and education and stuff like that. So $7.5 billion over 5 years of a quote-unquote civilian surge. Pakistan Army's reaction was, this money will come with it, many Americans will come, they will all be CIA agents, etc., etc. So, and in one of my conversations, I said, look, this is a bill for creating schools and hospitals and things that our own budget doesn't allow us to do. How is it anti-military? And one of the generals said, but that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to drive a wedge between the civilians by raising their expectations of what they can and should have and what we are able to provide, and therefore that weakens or undermines the military. Now, anybody who thinks like that doesn't have a big picture understanding, but they do have a very good PR and propaganda machine. I mean, there are people in this town who know. Even in my embassy, when I was ambassador, I had a long-running battle. Most probably some of you have heard about it, read about it. The military operates, or the military personnel in the embassy operate independent of the ambassador. They reach out to people, they offer people to come, they've flown people on helicopters to Waziristan to show what the great work they were doing. So people very easily get convinced that something is changing or something has changed. Remember Musharraf's famous picture on the front page of the Washington Post with his two poodles? A man who loves dogs cannot actually be an Islamic fundamentalist. And the number of people who used to say, I had a scotch with Musharraf. How can somebody who serves the scotch be sympathetic to the Islamist? That actually doesn't understand, and I alluded to it earlier in my presentation. It's about identity. I mean, look, the Pakistan Army existed before Pakistan. So its institutional interests in their mind are the interests of Pakistan. They don't want little civilians like me trying to argue that maybe higher literacy rate is also in Pakistan's interest. They just don't like that argument. And so they have this ability every few years. Now, I wish I had started sort of, a share option or a market option on this, because I would have been a very rich man. I have been saying since 2002 that the Pakistan military is not really changing, and there are people in this room who remember my arguments with them about Musharraf and why he's the right man and he's going to do the right thing. And then it was Kiani is the right man, General Kiani, who was the army chief after him, and he's going to do the right thing. Then General Rahid Sharif. And each time there's a new excuse and a new explanation. Zardari, President Zardari, whom I served, he was going to do the right thing because his wife had just been killed by terrorists. So he will do it. If something hasn't happened in 20 years, everybody should sort of take a deep breath and analyze why it hasn't happened. And why it hasn't happened has factors other than the ones you've been paying attention to, obviously. So it's not about whether they like their scotch or not. It's not whether they've been trained here or not. It's not whether they have poodles or not. It's about how they see Pakistan's place under the sun, and how they see Pakistan as being able to rival India. It's a kind of an Islamo-nationalism that does not have to do with Islam, the religion and faith in terms of practice. Yes, Ziaul Haq was a more practicing Muslim. Yes, there have been generals of Pakistan Army who pray 5 times a day. But those who don't pray 5 times a day either, they also have to figure out, why does this country exist? And what do we do about its identity? Because in some parts of Pakistan, the ethnic identity is stronger. I mean, there was a kingdom of Sindh for centuries before the British took it over and then rendered it into Pakistan. The Pashtun areas were until 1893 part of Afghanistan. Baluchistan was an autonomous principality or a princely state until March of 1948, most of it at least. So therefore, there are all these people who have these ideas about identity that don't conform to the ideas of the Pakistan military. And the Pakistan military is afraid of that, and that is why it sees religion as the one unifier that's easier, because that applies to everyone. So that, I think, is what needs to be understood. The role of religion in Pakistani nationalism and the role of the military in its own mind in defining Pakistan. It's not about these other extraneous factors that make people think a new generation. Any number of generations will come till they have dealt with this issue or changed their minds about this. They will have no alternative but to be the cookies that are cut from the cookie cutter called the Pakistan Military Academy.
Do you see any hope for changing that point of view?
Well, no, I certainly agree with all of that, and you know what I would say is that it's very interesting, and of course the seminal book on the Pakistan military was written many years ago by our friend Steve Cohen, and I always remember him talking about how the Pakistani military could recruit two boys from the Padahar Plateau, and one of them would be taken in as a jundi, as an enlisted man, and the other one would be put through the officer training program and come out as an officer. And that these were two guys with identical backgrounds, and yet one would become an officer and the other one not. And I think that to their credit, I would have to say that this is a positive thing. The Pakistan military has been able, for generation after generation of officers, to regenerate itself and to turn out officers who basically saw the world through the same lens that Husain is describing. So no, I don't think that it's going to change. And also, of course, not only do they turn out these officers, but how many generations of Pakistani officers have come to the United States through the IMET program, for the FMS program. We went through a long period of time where we had cut them off from access to IMET. We restored IMET thinking that perhaps we would be able to influence a new generation of officers, that they would see the world differently and they would see the relationship with the United States differently. That didn't work. They went back to Pakistan and they had exactly the same worldview that they had before they left. So in fact, this is I agree with Husain that this is deeply ingrained. I think that, to a certain extent, and I don't want to put Pakistan on the psychologist's couch, and I think that Husain knows the country much better than I do, but to me, this is a reflection of the fact that Pakistan has never recovered from 1971. And since 1971, it's been searching for an identity, and this is the only identity that's been able to develop. This is the only way that Pakistan can justify its existence in its own mind. And the only way that the Pakistani military can justify what it's doing in its own mind is through this identity as a religion. And then the other point that I would make, of course, is to the extent that this also is an important element of Pakistan's regional policy and the importance of having that religious identity in terms of the relationship with Saudi Arabia particularly, but also the broader Gulf states. Also, when Mohammed bin Salman goes to Pakistan and puts $10 billion down on the table, it's not because he loves South Asia, and I think that that's also a factor.
Okay, I have I've three people at least. Paul Pilar, you were the first, so wait for the mic. It's right here, and you say your name.
Yeah, Paul Pilar. Thank you both for these presentations. Given how Afghanistan is sometimes described as Pakistan's strategic depth, as well as one of the playing fields in which the Indian-Pakistani competition plays out, how might different possible ways of settling the Afghan war, different peace formulas that might emerge from the current talks in Doha, affect, if at all, Pakistan's overall degree of assertiveness or aggressiveness vis-a-vis India, including over the Kashmir issue? Might, for example, if the future of Afghanistan is one in which the Afghan Taliban have a dominant role, would Islamabad see this as a form of reassurance and a reason to be more relaxed, or would it have the opposite effect or no effect whatsoever?
I think they would see it as that, But and empirical evidence does not really weigh much in their calculations. We've seen that before. The fact remains that even the last Taliban regime before 9/11 did not behave exactly as the Pakistanis wanted it to, and they will have problems of that nature again. Look, here's a very interesting paradox. The Afghans have always had a stronger sense of nationhood, but their state has been always very weak. Pakistan is the opposite. Pakistan has always had a strong state, but the Pakistani idea of nationhood is much weaker. And this whole Afghan adventure was meant to secure Pakistan against Pashtun identity irredentism, and that hasn't happened. There's a new younger generation of Pashtuns who's asserting themselves all over again. So I don't see anything changing. All that will change is that America will come out. And in a way, it will be a rerun of what happened after the Soviets. And if you were the Taliban, who would you be looking for support? It won't just be, you don't want to be completely dependent on the brigadier or major general assigned by the ISI to tell you what to do. So therefore you will create some flexibility. That's how they ended up in the arms of Al-Qaeda, because they needed other sources of revenue and money and support. And so I am one of those who thinks that Afghanistan is one of those places where looking for flawed peace formulas is not the best of ideas. Again, sometimes a strategic pause is the best strategy. Just pause and stay. And the India-Pakistan rivalry in Afghanistan is also not going to come to an end, because the Pakistanis have bet everything on the Taliban. I mean, who else is their friend in Afghanistan now? Nobody. Now, Afghanistan's demographics are such that the old sort of equation in which the Pashtuns were dominant has diminished. The other ethnicities, and as a result of the wars, etc., have become much more stronger and assertive. Pakistan has no relationship with the Tajiks. It has virtually no relationship with the Uzbeks or the Hazaras. The Hazaras have a closer relationship with Iran. The Uzbeks have a closer relationship with Uzbekistan. The Tajiks are on their own. Those groups are not going to accept subservience to Pakistan. So if Pakistan could be smarter and say, you know what we want is a friendly Afghanistan. So we will become friends with whoever is in power in Afghanistan. That would lessen the burden and the pressures, but that's not the way the Pakistan army unfortunately thinks. So I think that we'll go through this whole exercise. It will become a good excuse for the US to leave if President Trump really wants to do that. There'll be a grand press, TV image of signing of agreements, etc., etc. It will be a matter of months before the Taliban, supported by their Punjabi fighters from Pakistan, will start gaining territory. There will be disputes, and then the Indians will come in like they did the last time. Why was the Northern Alliance still surviving until 9/11? Americans weren't involved before 9/11. The Russians had left. It was the Indians who had been providing some sustenance and support to these residual Northern Alliance people. Unfortunately, something like that will happen all over again.
Jerry?
Yeah, I can't find reason for conflict. I'm not sure that there are many options out there, in terms of if you think that there are different kinds of scenarios for how the conflict in Afghanistan is going to end. I'm not sure that there are. I think it will end with the U.S. Acquiescing in a strong Taliban situation. Don't forget, I mean, we can go back and go one step farther even than Hussein has gone and make the point that in fact, prior to 1978, prior to the Sahara Revolution, Afghanistan was in fact a Pashtun-dominated government, but it certainly didn't mean that there was a close relationship with Pakistan. In fact, if you go all the way back, Afghanistan was the only country in the United Nations that opposed the partition and the creation of Pakistan in the first place. They never recognized the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They never recognized the Durand Line. And so, do you assume that there's going to be, under any circumstance, a close Afghan-Pakistani relationship? Probably not. The two have inherently different views. the other reality, of course, is the extent to which a new Afghan government might look more to Iran, and don't forget that the way that the Indians can exert influence in Afghanistan isn't through Pakistan, it's through Iran. It's through the development of the port in Chabahar, and that will be the entree point. And I suspect that the Indians will want to develop that and see that, that this is the way that they're going to be able to neutralize this idea of Afghanistan as Pakistan's strategic depth, and that this is a relationship. The other question, of course, is, so you have the Taliban in Afghanistan, you have the Pakistani Taliban. What's going to be the relationship between them? When the Pakistani Taliban are no longer of use to the Pakistani military because they no longer have the issue of Afghanistan, where they need that card to play, where they need the Haqqani network to play inside Afghanistan. What's going to be the relationship of the Pakistani Taliban to the government, to the military, and will the Afghans in a Taliban-influenced, if not dominated government, see the Pakistani Taliban as a tool that they can use against Pakistan, as opposed to the other way that it's been for the last 40 years?
Thank you very much. So if we get the microphone here, the ambassador. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have a rather specific question, and I was wondering whether
This is the ambassador development. Right?
yes, but I mean, to share your assessment, if you can, on the significance or the effectiveness of the regular contacts that have been put in place again between the military of the two countries, the borderline. I think there have been
India, Pakistan.
Yes, correct. And I think that they're all. This is an old mechanism, but I think 1 year ago they were put in place again. I mean, I was wondering whether these regular contacts, of whatever level, operational, tactical, did they work? And if they didn't work, why not? And if they work, is there room for improvement and to give them also kind of preventive dimension in the kind of contacts? Is that something that that can be further explored or not?
Which you would like to
We could both have a go at it.
I suppose if I go first, I mean, my experience is that whenever there's a problem, that's the first thing to go is the dialogue on the mill level. So yeah, can you is it something that contributes, generally speaking, to some kind of understanding, perhaps, but it's not. It hasn't been, in my experience, the thing that can help diffuse crises when they emerge. It certainly didn't happen in 2008. I don't think it happened this time. I think it was really more, at the political level, Imran Khan and the leadership, kind of backing off a little bit and defusing the situation. So I think it's probably not a bad thing to keep working on, but it's certainly not a vehicle at this point, in my view, that allows for resolving issues as they emerge.
So two important points. One is, of course, the formal connection, which is the Director General of the military operations being in touch with it. That is a very good idea, because that ensures that if there's an accidental situation, the two can inform each other and they can diffuse things. The bigger political issues can't be resolved by that. The Pakistani military doesn't want its serving officers in any of these things. So these many track twos are going on, and many of our European friends are spending a lot of money on this. Those track twos essentially are only track 1.25, because the Pakistani state is a controlled state. The people with independent views are like myself, sitting here or somewhere else. There are some living in, because if you go back to Pakistan, you will either be kidnapped. There are 5,000 missing persons in Pakistan, according to the Supreme Court of Pakistan, who they believe, the Supreme Court said that these 5,000 people are probably in the they are in the custody of Pakistan's security services. So I mean, and not having an open society and not having a free environment basically means that the only people who come to these so-called track twos are essentially people who have been approved of by the intelligence service to be able to score points. And so no real thing has ever emerged out of this. 2008, I was very much there. Jerry, you might remember, I was ambassador. And basically, I delivered a list of names to the Pakistani military and to the President of Pakistan, provided by the CIA, that these are the people who we think were involved. And the army chief arranged for them to be arrested that very night to defuse the situation, because the army knew where they were. But that was again political level, not the military to military officers engaging, sort of having whiskeys with one another, paid for by the European Union.
Well, and remember that we were absolutely begging the Pakistanis to have Pasha go over to India to meet with his counterpart.
Which the civilian government said will happen,
And
and
the
then
military-
Pasha undermined it by creating a raucous sort of noise in the parliament and everything. You see, the nature of Pakistan's state has to be understood. This pretense of, like, it's a democracy, etc. Yes, it has elections, but it's also a very authoritarian, semi-authoritarian regime. And the military intelligence apparatus has the ability to generate propaganda. And so they can make anybody, so they were the ones who said, no, it will be a humiliation if the Pakistani intelligence chief goes to India to give an accounting for what happened. Later on, what did Pakistan do? Pakistan claimed, which by the way is legally total nonsense, that the evidence that had been accumulated in India will not be admissible in Pakistani courts. Pakistan's courts have ruled many times before, when Pakistan and India have relatively, until 1965, Pakistan and India did not have a visa. So you could go back and forth. And in those days, Pakistan's superior courts had ruled that evidence that is collected on one side of the border is admissible on the other side. So totally defying all legal precedent, etc., to do this is a function of the deep state, and they were able to manipulate that even then.
Right. So the bottom line again is that it's very nice. You can have these dialogues, you can have these conversations as long as everything is stable. But when there's a crisis, the first thing that goes is the dialogue.
Yes, next speaker's next to Paul here.
Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, now Johns Hopkins and the Wilson Center. This has been a terrific discussion. Question directed primarily to Ambassador Haqqani. You've made both speakers, I think, have made a compelling case that some sort of strategic neglect and disregard on the part of the United States towards Pakistan is in order. And I think it was pretty clear that we would expect that vacuum, to the extent that there is one, would be filled by China. And I would be interested in your thoughts about what that would mean. What role would China actually play in Pakistan, and what kind of relationship would emerge between Chinese security services and the Pakistan military? And when Pakistan's identity politics runs up against the Chinese nationalism, what happens?
Okay, so first of all, there's already a very deep relationship between China and the Pakistan military. It goes back to 1965. For China, Pakistan is a very cheap secondary deterrent to India. I mean, the logic for China is very simple. Keep bolstering the Pakistani military and the Pakistani state, because that keeps about 500,000 Indian troops engaged on the Pakistani border. And so India is not free to look at China. And so that is all they have done so far in the last many decades. They were instrumental in helping Pakistan in their nuclear program, in their missile program. So it's a very deep running relationship. The US-Pakistan relationship has been transactional. The Americans have given money, and they've got some cooperation. Base in Badabir for the Cold War at one time, operational facilities for Afghanistan during the war against the Soviets, logistical support during this. But the interests of the two countries have diverged considerably even in the past, and now they are completely divergent. Pakistan would like a world led by China rather than by the US. India has become America's natural partner. So I think when you said what happens when, I would say it's already happened. The only thing is that American money is kind of not being spent on trying to get Pakistan to do the little that it has been doing in the past. That's the real change that has occurred. Now, in terms of U.S. interests, I think if you were like doing a back of the envelope calculus of who your potential friends and sources of trouble are in that part of the world, you could have easily put Pakistan into the Chinese camp rather than in the American one. And the deep state relationship runs deeper and will become even deeper once the American technology and resources are not available to Pakistan. You use the term strategic neglect. Look, my point is that America could have a sophisticated, complex, and nuanced strategic policy, but I hope everybody around this room will not see it as an insult and agree with me that the complex, nuanced, and multi-layered strategic sort of approaches are rather difficult to execute in this town. So therefore, in the absence of that, I think the strategic neglect is a better option for the simple reason that the American closeness to Pakistan ends up reinforcing Pakistan. I have a book out several years ago titled Magnificent Delusions, in which I argued how some of Pakistan's policy decisions are essentially delusions. Look, the size difference between Pakistan and India is the same as between Belgium and France. But nobody in Belgium ever wants to dominate France. I mean, you know, they all want to, they are happy to have a relationship with them. They are happy to be part of a union with them, but none of them think we have to teach them a lesson one day. And that is the real problem in Pakistan. Second, 72 years is not long enough, and 78 years if you include the 6 years before the career, 72 years is not enough to create a sense of nationhood that runs really deep and is sufficiently self-confident that everybody says, you know, now nobody wakes up thinking, who am I, but rather, what am I to do? And that point hasn't been reached in case of Pakistan. The American support and funding for Pakistan has actually ended up supporting some of those delusions. So the reason why I say backing off might not be a bad idea is because at least the delusions diminish a little bit. Even this time, one of the reasons why the moves were so quick. Last time Pakistan downed an Indian pilot in 1999. It took them 10 days before they decided that they are going to release him. And this time it was 3 days. And that time the Americans had urged them and the Chinese had urged them to release. This time nobody urged, it automatically happened. The reason being, China wasn't supporting Pakistan either publicly. Although if the chips were down, China would have supported them. But China also took the approach of, hey guys, sort it out. So there might be some maturity that might come into the conduct of states in that region if you are not always on the phone telling each side what is in their best interest.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, that's.
Next, Marvin, next one. Right.
Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute. I was interested in this question of the
way in which Pakistan is consumed with its security relationship vis-a-vis India. Everything we've been talking about here has focused on the Pakistan side. So I was wondering whether the panelists thought that in this two-party game, India has some responsibility as well in, if not changing this mindset that Hussein has so well articulated, if it is not playing the role which would make this this transition here, if it at all, and it'll take time, as you suggested, can help redefine the way in which Pakistan looks at its relationship with India. In short, where can India play a more positive role in this, and what's likely to be the response?
Which one?
Yeah, no, it is a good question. You know, I would say we've tried. Of course, we haven't had the influence on the Indians over the years that we, kind of had the influence on the Pakistanis, and so our ability to really promote that kind of engagement on the part of the Indians has been limited. One of the things, not to keep harping back to 2008, but one of the things that was really remarkable to us sitting in Islamabad at that particular moment was that we had complete access. I mean, we were in a situation where we were saying that, we basically agreed with the Indian narrative that what happened was the responsibility of the Pakistanis and that this was a government of Pakistan failure that allowed this situation to develop. And yet, even though we were in somewhat of an adversarial relationship with the Pakistanis, we had complete access to the Pakistanis. We could go, we could go see Zardari, of course, Kayani whenever we wanted, Pasha whenever we wanted. They would sit, they would talk to us, they would respond. We had complete
General Durrani
access.
was still there, if you remember. General Durrani was
And
there.
Durrani.
Too,
Yeah, so it was a very easy dialogue and a very easy conversation. Whereas our counterparts sitting over in New Delhi, even though we were supporting their position, were completely inaccessible to the embassy. They stiff-armed us. They wouldn't share anything with us. They wouldn't talk to us about any of these things. And so they were extremely aggressive. And I think, my own experience with the Indians is that they do things, their way, and they're not interested in what anybody else thinks about it. And so, would it make sense? I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to promote private sector contacts between India and Pakistan. To try to build up the relationship that way. If you don't have a government-to-government relationship, look at the private sector, look at the business community, where certainly in our view there was a lot of shared mutual benefit that could accrue from having a relationship. But it went absolutely nowhere, and it went nowhere because of obstacles on both sides of the border. Nobody was interested in pursuing that kind of relationship, and I think probably because both sides were getting signals from their governments that they didn't want to see these things happen. So are you right that the Indians could do a better job of reaching out? I mean, because the Indians have their own psychology. I think, if you want to go back again, not to put people on the couch, but to what extent do the Indians still resent the fact that there was partition? To what extent do the Indians believe that that Pakistan is really India and should be India, and it's only a fluke of history that they didn't have the opportunity to ensure that it continued as India. So, I don't know. It's an interesting question, but there's a maturity issue on both sides.
I would argue. I would argue that there's a lot that India could do to try and diminish this psychology, and I've spoken about it many times in the past. But I think the time for that is now past, unfortunately. The way the Indians see it, they were relatively nicer to Pakistan in the 50s and the 60s. They were nicer to Pakistan in the 70s. After the loss of East Pakistan, their troops went into East Pakistan, left in 6 months after Bangladesh had been created. They released the prisoner of war. So they've now become, Pakistan had an anti-India narrative for a long time. And India did not have that. Yes, they did have this thing about partition shouldn't have taken place, but now the Indians have a anti-Pakistan narrative with a vengeance. And so my little book, India versus Pakistan, ended with a poem by a Pakistani poet who just died recently, who basically said, oh, so you're just like us. You know, we started trying to define our identity through religion. Now you're doing it as well. We lynched Hindus. Now you're lynching Muslims. So you're just like, and unfortunately the opportunity is bad. But as far as the US and other world is concerned, look, the Indians do still have a deep-seated resentment against the fact that the American role in South Asia enabled Pakistan to prolong the conflict as long as it has been. That left on its own, India would have probably been able to figure out something or deal with Pakistan. Now, the range of opinions in India is quite a lot on that, from those who think, oh well, we would have been able to beat up Pakistan, to those who say we could have had a easier, friendlier, good neighborly relationship like the kind we have, say for example, with Bangladesh. But then no one in Pakistan wants to be West Bangladesh. I mean, they have a sense of what Pakistan is. Pakistan in its mind is a great power. And as a Pakistani, I have come under a lot of attack for being this realist who tells people, you don't become a great power when every 3 years you have a foreign exchange crisis and you have to beg, borrow to sort of just pay off your last installments of your loans. And what the Indians are now trying to do, which I think is dangerous, and I agree with you that the Indians could do better on this, but what they're trying to do is, okay, you know what, you have always accused us of wanting Pakistan to be weakened and possibly eliminated. Well, you know what, we'll create the circumstances for your own predictions and your own fears to come true, because you just don't have the economic capability, and that will make Pakistan even more insecure. But the insecurity of Pakistan is a psychological and has preceded the nastiness that we are seeing from the Indian side now. It has been there even in the good and much better times, when the Indian attitude was a lot more flexible. And now I think that moment of flexibility is gone. Can it come again? Hopefully it can. But right now, as a Pakistani, I feel the onus is very much on Pakistan. The moment you look, the economic difference is increasing. The difference in other fields is also increasing. Just to throw a statistic just like that, right now there are 120,000 Indian students enrolled in American universities. The number of Pakistani students is only 6,700. Just a random statistic. I mean, the difference between the two countries in everything is just multiplying. And so the way Indians see it, we tried the talks approach, we tried the generous approach, the magnanimous approach, the this approach, and the nasty approach as well, going to war. The Indian narrative is every war was started by Pakistan, etc., etc. So now, okay, stew in your juices. And that creates a very, it's not a good situation to be, but I think the room for persuading the Indians to change is relatively less right now, unfortunately. It's not what I want, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, I would just add that your recollection of Indian magnanimity is a little bit less than, or a little bit greater than mine. I got to Pakistan in 1976, and there were still Pakistani prisoners of war sitting in Indian camps, left over from 1971. They didn't return for another year or so. And I will always remember Indira Gandhi's comment about how dare they lift their eyes to us in 1981. When we were trying to support Pakistan. So I'm not sure that I would give India quite as much credit for being benevolent or
nobody says they were benevolent,
or
magnanimous. But they were less harsh than they are now, is my argument. And in their view, your conduct actually enabled Pakistan much more. For example, the 65 war is a classic example. If the Pakistani Air Force hadn't been provided the jets that had been provided to them, the tanks that had been provided to them, they wouldn't have started the war.
Well, it's a good thing that we did it then.
So
enabled them to start the war?
That concludes the people who put their hands up. I would just like to close on one question that is slightly different from what we've been discussing. I mean, I have noticed, particularly since the times that I worked for the Aspen Congressional Group in Congress, that there's more and more Indian influence in Congress than we can imagine. I mean, that it's clearly impressive, and it reflects not only demography but business interests. Do you think this ultimately is going to make it even more difficult for the United States to have a tough policy on India towards Pakistan?
Short answer, yes.
Yeah.
Demographically, the Indians outnumber the Pakistanis 1:10 here, maybe more actually. The quality of the immigrants also makes a huge difference. The Indians are engaged in the political process. There are 6 Indian Americans who are congressmen right now, are members of Congress. They also engage heavily in raising funds, etc. They are present in the American government. There was a time in the Obama administration when I counted 8 assistant secretaries who were Indian Americans. I mean, they were American born, but they were people of 2 governors at that time, one of South Carolina, one of Louisiana. And the Indian diaspora is more easily assimilated somehow than the Pakistani diaspora. So yeah, I think that is a problem. And as I must say that as ambassador, I wrote a paper for the Pakistan government warning them of it in 2008, saying, hey, this is what's coming, you know. So before it hits us in the face, let's prepare for it and see what we can do to change. Unfortunately, the willingness to admit that we are the weaker party in the equation does not seem to exist in Islamabad.
The other factor, I think, it's not only that there's a much larger Indian community and in many ways a more prosperous, although the Pakistani community in the United States is a reasonably, relatively prosperous one, but it's also that the Indian community, for whatever reason, seems to be able to pull together in a way that the Pakistani community isn't. Pakistani community tends to be very divided along political lines, along other kinds of lines.
Ethnic lines.
Whereas the Indians, even if they disagree about things in India, when they're here, they tend to speak with a more unified voice, and that increases their influence.
Thank you both very much for an extremely elucidated and interesting presentations, and we have not heard the end of this, believe you me. Thank you.